Hi, thank you very much for the opportunity to share my cooking favorites with you today. I have 20 minutes, so probably is enough time for that. Actually like making Indonesian lumpias recently because of our trip to Indonesia, but let's not dwell too much on that because I don't think you've come for that. So thank you for the opportunity to talk about cyber in the boardroom. It says in the program. I've taken the liberty to walk a bit around that topic. I think it's a hugely important topic at the moment for boards because of the really fundamental changes that we see. Businesses digitizing their processes, bringing IT into their core processes everywhere, trying to be agile about that. We see threat actors still getting better and more diverse, criminal gangs and nation states, etc. I don't need to tell you about those. And so that means that regulators also take a keen interest. And they're really pushing boards to understand cyber a lot better today. For example, when I was at Shell, the UK government would send us a survey, and they would send it to the board and say, please fill in this perspective that you have on cyber. And at the bottom it read, don't give this to your CIO or CISO. And we talked to some other companies. Of course, everybody just gave it to the CIO and CISO to get the answers and then have a conversation, because in actual fact, mostly boards are not that well educated yet. Cyber also enters into audits nowadays. The external auditors have a task, so that's also making things a bit more formal. But if you then look at the right-hand side of this slide, are we really on top of this? Do we really have the processes and the people to deal with all of that new stuff that's coming at us? And I think we should really take note of this problem. I think I'm now missing the slide that I asked to put in, but sorry about that. So there is a slide that I was going to show. And that slide talks about the story with the boards. So how do boards talk about cyber? What are the main topics? So first and foremost, of course, this should be a risk conversation, because in the end, all of this stuff is risk. There's no such thing as absolute security. There's no such thing as absolute compliance with regulations. Even also there, you have a risk. You have to have a risk approach. Like GDPR, data privacy, 100% compliance with that, just not possible. So do we understand what the right focus is in terms of risk? What are our top risk scenarios? What are the most important mitigations? That's one conversation. And it should not be just about dashboards that you try and color green, but a true rich conversation about what these risks are, based on true understanding. I think there's also something that boards have to ask themselves: how am I actually doing this stuff compared to others, to peers, to the industry? So capability assessments, capability maturity assessments, independent ones, I think are vital and boards should discuss. Because of course you can and have to trust your CISO, but because of the consequences this topic can have for the company, I think it's not good enough to just rely on the stuff you get from your own organization. You really need to look at the peers. And of course, businesses in general are used to do that in different areas of their core processes as well. So why not do that in cyber? And then in the boardroom, the discussion on cyber should also be about incidents. So the incidents in the media always give good trigger. Could that happen to us? Do I understand it? Do I need to take any extra measures? Is there a new threat factor? Did we take that into account? All of that good stuff. What were our incidents over the last period? Do I need to get worried about those because they are sort of increasing? What near misses did I have, and things like that? So it's the incident piece, and then the final piece, I think, is about resilience. So how resilient are we? Because it's going to happen at some point in time. A bigger thing is going to happen, and are we then prepared? So how do you do that? Now, for example, if you're a financial institution in the UK, and by the way, also now in the Netherlands, you get independent companies to come and try and breach you. And those are breach tests, and they have consequences, so they will be evaluated with the regulator, etc. So I think that's a great method, although I'm a bit worried about the bureaucracy around these processes in the financial services, because I think they get 4 weeks of real testing out of 9-month programs, because they talk a lot with each other about scope and things like that. It's not so efficient. But red teaming, and especially with independent parties that come and try and breach you, and then you see, can I detect these guys? Can I actually get them out of the system quickly? And can I recover my operations quickly? That last bit is usually not tested, because that's a bit dangerous. So you do that separately in a crisis simulation, where you simulate. Again, financial services are pretty good at that. Data center down, we move to a backup, etc. That sort of resilience, of course, is in the end probably the most important thing. And with GDPR, breach notification, do I understand when I talk to the regulator about what? Is getting very important, because if you make mistakes there, you can have done lots and lots of good stuff before that, and you're just unlucky, and then it happens, and then you make mistakes in your communication with the regulator, and it might cost you dearly. So those are the 4 topics that I think should be on the board agenda. I had a slide on them. Sorry, I had to do it by heart. If you're interested in the slide, I can still share it with you afterwards. And that's all to have a discussion on risk appetite, because that's in the end where you want to get to. What mitigations do I really want to put in place against what scenarios, IT assets, etc. What resilience do I want to put in place, etc. That's where the board really should come in. Does the board necessarily understand all of these topics when they go into these meetings? I don't think so. There's, I think, now a good practice emerging, where boards are getting themselves some independent training, so not done by the people in the company, by another company, so that they're a bit better prepared to ask the right questions in these conversations. And I think that's all very, very important that we get that right. There is another topic in the program that I was going to address and will address. It's digitization, cyber digitization as a business opportunity. I see cyber, of course, there's lots of business opportunity in companies like KPMG and companies that have security services to offer. But I think if you look at digitization as an opportunity, I think we should also try and revert it and say, if the business digitizes its core processes, can we not much better digitize our risk management processes? Because if you look what's happening today, the challenges that are coming at us, the complexity of the whole situation, and we're still doing lots and lots and lots of stuff manual, and we're doing it with analysts that need to do all of this stuff in their heads. And I can tell you, if you do research into the consistency of, for example, control selections or risk assessments from analysts, and I'm talking about good analysts, the consistency is very low. So why is that? That is because they're trying to do a lot of calculations in their head based on half information, half incomplete data sets. And I think we need to change that. I think we need to go and digitize the risk management processes. And why is that so critical? It's because it's all connected. Today we have people doing risk assessments, we have people busy with control frameworks, with people that look at threat radars, risk radars, like where are my threat actors, and etc. You probably know these things that cyber defense teams tend to do. All of those groups, teams, in large organizations we can talk about up to 1,500 people doing this. Smaller organizations, of course, have scaled this to the right level. But all of these people are doing their bits, but they're not really well connected. So if somebody updates the threat radar and says, oh, now phishing goes up or down on my threat radar, the people doing the risk assessments have no idea about that. They cannot actually process that data. So we believe that if you can actually put one data model below this and facilitate all of those activities through automation, digitization, then you can actually use that information in your assessments, in your discussions with the board in a much more effective way, and in fact even reduce the amount of people that you need rather than increase them, even in this new, more challenging environment. Just one example of that. We all know that nowadays the cloud services that you can get with your credit card are getting more powerful and more powerful. And that means that businesses are sort of circumventing IT departments and go and buy stuff themselves. Sometimes that's built into something they're buying. A lot of the services you now buy, business services you buy, will have IT in them because it's almost impossible that it will not. But sometimes people also just buy directly IT services or start using them even without buying it. That creates all sorts of issues if you're not careful. We're all focusing on the IT that's happening in the company, and there is this big gap, looming gap that's getting bigger and bigger because IT departments are having more and more trouble actually delivering the right stuff in time to this business that wants to transform itself. So we all know that then people take efforts to go and scan what is being used, and they use CASB services like Sky High, etc. We also have these cases where we're asked to come in and we present the company with a list of stuff and say, this is your gap here. But then what? Are we just going to deal with that list? List gone, and then there's another list, and another list, and another list, and it keeps going and even grows. So our view is that if you digitize this properly, by putting discovery in place, so you make sure you know what the traffic is, by capturing the forward proxy traffic, hopefully if now are moving stuff to the cloud from a forward proxy perspective, because then you can capture all of your traffic also from home workers and bring your own device, etc., because that's also dangerous traffic, of course, potentially. You correlate that with a database of services, cloud services like Sky High, and I talk here about Zscaler and Sky High because we work with them a lot, but there are alternatives, so don't take it that these are the only ones that do that, but you can correlate the two. So you see the traffic, you look at the Sky High database, it says, this is a reasonable service, it's not such a good service. They call it risk ratings, but in fact, of course, they are security ratings. Because risk has to do with potential impact, and they don't know that, because they don't know why you use it. So if you then correlate that data with the application database in the company, you can actually filter out everything that you can't recognize, and you can start bringing in a triage. The business that is using it, you intervene in their use of the system, or you send them an email link, whatever you prefer, and then you start asking them questions like, oh, you're using this. Is this maybe it has a different name in the application database or not? But you try and get to grips with what this is. And and there's several outcomes possible, of course. Either it's great business using something which is relatively harmless in terms of potential impact, and they're using a proper service for it. No big deal. We just make sure we note it, and it's fine. Or other end of the spectrum, they're doing something which is very, very bad because they're doing something which is potentially high impact, and they're using a bad service for that. And then you can just stop it and say, we cannot do that, we need to talk, you need to do something else. Or maybe the situation is, oh, this is very complex. We need to get somebody to help you to actually really understand this because you're working with personal data here or whatever. And then there may be also situations where it's a bit gray. We say, it's okay-ish, but I want you to do these things in terms of access management, things like that. If you do this, you capture stuff early, almost immediately, although you typically don't want to intervene with them before they've used it a couple of times, because a lot of people on the internet, of course, just try stuff out and then stop doing it. But if you see some repetition, then you can intervene. And then the discussion is also not that bad, that you come in and tell them you shouldn't do this. If you come 1.5 years after they started using it and they get completely attached to it and their business process is hinging on it, and you tell them to stop doing it, you have a big problem. So this is just one example where the digitization of risk management processes can really help you to reduce your effort, because this is almost zero effort for the second line of defense, for the risk managers. It's pretty low in terms of burden on the business. You can show you're trying to help them by not cutting everything off, but letting lots of stuff go, which is okay from a risk perspective. And you get lots of transparency, which you can share with your audit committee, with the board, etc., which you otherwise wouldn't have. That's the beginning of that cycle that I showed you. Discovery. And then I just want to show you one thing about the final bit, because we do a lot of these things. You recognize that, matrices, heat maps, etc., for risk assessments, and there's lots of issues with those things because they use ordinal scales, low, medium, high, and you want to apply them at different levels of the company. So you will want to be able to aggregate up and drill down, because otherwise it's very strange. You cannot talk to, let's say, in Shell, the downstream business, and then below that retail or company level. And hopefully, when you talk about these risks, it's relatively consistent what you're doing. Yeah? That's almost impossible with these things. Lots of issues with them. And a lot of parties now are advocating that you really start quantifying these risks. And it sounds rather far-fetched, perhaps, but I do think it's really possible. But we need a practical method to do that actually uses data that's already there, that uses some insights that come from the industry, and that make it a real low-effort exercise for companies, and create the consistency and the transparency that people would like to have. So we've actually, in KPMG, worked on a new method with Doug Hubbard. And he wrote this book, How to Measure Anything in Cybersecurity. If you have not read that book, I would really suggest you have a go at that. It's very compelling, I think, the case that he makes for making a step up in this area. And he provides some practical help in terms of the statistics that you need to use. And what we have added is a model that's easy to use, that's decomposed. It's a standard model. You don't need to start thinking yourself, oh, I need to build a model. How do I do that? We see that in many companies, by the way, that somewhere in the corner somebody thought, this may be a good idea. I have connections with FAIR, or I'm trying to go and do ISF RM2, and I'm going to sit here and do some spreadsheets and maybe even have an academic connection. And what you typically see happening there is the sustainability is not there, but also the trust is not there. Other people will look at it and go like, yeah, is this really correct? So we want to change that game. We have a very simple model. If we have the critical assets, and we have the impact assessments on those critical assets, we know the controls that are applied, and we know whether they are effective, we can generate a loss exceedance curve by doing these type of simulations. So we simulate all of the possible ways that these things can happen. See a very simple model of the IT environment, some very simple attack step modeling, and we are actually maintaining as a company now a matrix which looks at which controls help to stop which attack steps. Call that a defense matrix. It's actually used by quite a few cyber defense teams nowadays to analyze if an incident happened, why that happened, and why it wasn't stopped. So this thing is not very new, but it's new in terms of industry-wide application as a sort of service. So what you then get is loss exceedance curves. Some parts of the business will love that because they know these things. Others would like you to translate it back to heat maps, which is fine. You can do it at every level in the company as long as you do not calculate with them. Use this in the background. And we've set up collaboration with two universities on these topics so that we get some real research behind it. On the left-hand side, an interesting one is the research into people's perception of these decision aid tools. What does it take for them to adopt these things? Are they actually willing to adopt them, or are they going to dismiss them because they do not do? It's very easy always with modeling. So you do it subjectively. You put some dots on a heat map, and somebody else says, "I'm going to model this," and now of course you can say, "Oh, this model is not correct in this way and in that way and in that way." Yes, that's probably true. These models are definitely not perfect. But what about the subjective interpretation? Is that better? You can't even check that interpretation. So you have this adoption dilemma, and we're researching that. What do you do? Which protocols do you need to get people to adopt this? So the bottom line is that we really think that, so that's the second example of digitization, that we can do risk quantification as a service. So it's in the cloud, you upload some basic data about your environment, and you get pretty good, and I would claim better than any analyst can create, views, insights into the risks of your company on the IT side. That's all I wanted to share, and I think I'm told that was more than enough. So, perhaps any questions, or sorry, do you take over?